Well, good afternoon, and welcome to Kendal Hall, and welcome to the first in a series of 25th anniversary celebrations for Kendal at Lexington. I'm Kevin Cavanaugh from the marketing staff at Kendal, and I'll be serving as the moderator of today's panel discussion. But first, in the Quaker way, may we please have a moment of silence. Thank you. Today's 25th anniversary event is one that we're calling Trailblazers, the beginnings of Kendal at Lexington. We'll meet our Trailblazers panelists in a moment, but first I want to tell you about other 25th anniversary events we have planned for this year. On February 18th, that's a Tuesday, there will be a special Kendal Singers concert right here in this room, followed by a wine reception. On May 8th, that's a Thursday, there will be an ice cream social for staff and residents on the patio behind Sunnyside House. Speaking of Sunnyside, a group of resident historians is writing a book about the history of this property that will come out later this year. On Wednesday, June 18th, there will be a special Kendal College event featuring W&L's Lena Hill. And then the big event on Thursday, July 17th, that will be the 25th anniversary gala event with a catered meal under a big tent in the courtyard here at Kendal for residents, board members, and invited dignitaries. So please mark your calendars and be looking for announcements of upcoming events in the Connections newsletter. Now, let's meet today's panelists. At the end, David Cox. He is an Episcopal priest and was rector at the R.E. Lee Episcopal Church when 30 years ago, he had the idea that Lexington could and should have a continuing care retirement community. David and his wife Melissa live here in Lexington, and by the way, they are on the wait list here with plans to eventually become residents themselves. Next to David is Dianne Herrick. She is a resident of Kendal at Lexington since 2013 and one of the founders. She and David are credited with assembling the original task force that eventually became the original board of directors of Lexington Retirement Community, Inc., doing business as Kendal at Lexington. Elizabeth Harralson is also a resident of Kendal at Lexington since 2020, along with her husband, John. Elizabeth was the very first marketing director of Kendal at Lexington and can share with us what it was like selling memberships, apartments, and cottages that had not yet been built. Mary Coulling is one of the very first residents of Kendal at Lexington, having moved here with her late husband Sid in July of 2000, our very first month. The Cowlings also helped provide encouragement and moral support to the founders of the community at times when the obstacles to building the Kendal community seemed overwhelming. Ruth Woodcock is also one of our very first residents, having moved here back in August of 2000, along with her late husband, Russ. Over the last 25 years, Ruth has been involved in so many areas of Kendal at Lexington, including serving on our board of directors. And Sarah Giddings has been a resident of Kendal at Lexington since October of 2000, when she moved here with her late husband, Don. Sarah has served on the Residence Council, Culture and Entertainment, Fitness, and Library committees, among others, and has stories about the early days here at Kendal, which was still somewhat under construction when she moved here. We'll hear a little bit more about that in a while. So thank you to all of our panelists for agreeing to participate in today's program. And the audience members, immediately following today's panel discussion, there will be a wine reception in the library right outside this room. So please stay if you can. to continue the discussion and the celebration of 25 years of Kendal at Lexington. Now, thank you. Now the important part. Let's go back to the year 1994 when the idea was first spoken out loud. David Cox, please tell us the circumstances that led to the idea of building a retirement community.
Okay. You want me here or stay here? What do you
think? Right where you are, it's fine.
Stay where I am. All right. I'm a preacher. I'm used to having to. Oh, well. Anyway, it's so good to be here. One correction. It was more like 1990 or 91 that I had the idea. I was driving home from visiting parishioners in over Westminster, Canterbury, and Lynchburg, and thought we need to have one of our own. But I quickly found out, and we did have a little bit of discussion with a number of people, but quickly found out that when the idea was left to me alone, it wasn't going anywhere. And it didn't until I happened one day to see Dianne Herrick across the street. She'd just gotten back from a sabbatical with Bruce, and she and I said, "What are you up to?" And she said, "I'm looking." And I said, "Let me take you to lunch." And she grasped the idea immediately. And being the true organizational genius that she is, she immediately said, "Well, now we need more people." Oh, yeah. And who could we get? So we came up with a list. And and we started approaching people. And every single one of them said yes. And I'd like to talk about those people. Dianne, of course, I've mentioned, and you know, and you'll hear from her. But there was Beth Thompson, who also had the idea, too, and had contacted Kendal initially, even in the late 1980s, and it wasn't time. Timing is everything, and that wasn't the time. But here she was, a local business person, strong member of Lexington Presbyterian. Matt Paxton, the editor of the local newspaper, deeply committed in his family for generations to this community and a real fixture. Farris Hotchkiss, who was the head of philanthropy at Washington and Lee, who brought that aspect into our discussion, as well as a very clear W&L connection. Frank Carell, who was at the time the head of the Prestar Bank, and brought that expertise to our table. Ned Henneman teaches law, taught law, and it was from, and I came to realize Ned was our skeptic on the board. But I quickly learned that lawyers get people out of trouble, but they serve even more importantly to keep people from getting into trouble in the first place. And that is very much his goal, to guide us along. Barton Dick, certainly one of the most respected doctors of the community, brought a lot of credibility to the medical community, as well, of course, as his expertise. Pam Simpson was also a member of that first exploratory committee. She was the first woman on the faculty of Washington Lee whose expertise was in historical architecture. And we were not surprised if we had no idea where we would go, but wouldn't have been surprised if we do end up with something historical, and we would certainly want to keep whatever we do in keeping with our community. And there were a couple of characteristics of all those people. Number one, they were all busy, very busy. They were all experts in their particular fields. So that they brought an expertise which was different but necessary. They were all dedicated to this community deeply, in many cases for generations. And they were all sharing the vision of what might be. It was the most remarkable group of people that I've ever worked with. We would meet in the library of the church, scheduled to start at 4:15. We would begin at 4:16, and we would finish at 5:15. People spoke only when they needed to. They wanted to get this job done. We had no money. We needed money for to find out whether this was possible. Diane's going to mention this in a moment, but we did eventually become a board, and there were some changes. Frank went off the board because he offered the bank as a meeting as our headquarters, our offices, and he didn't want any conflict of interest. Pam had other things to do. We brought in other people. Paul Maney, who was head of the BMI Alumni Association, that brought that institution into the mix.
John Ellis.
I mentioned you. I knew there was somebody. John Ellisted. Thank you. John Ellisted, city manager, was in there from the beginning. I kept counting 9, and I knew there were 10 of us. So there we are. Thank you. Bill Klein joined, at the board at this point, as also did Adelaide Simpson and Hank Sharp, who ended up to be among our first residents here. Kip Purple, who taught economics at Washington and Lee. George Bent Sr. George Bent, the teacher at Washington and Lee, his father organized, was the guiding light behind Kendal at Oberlin. And so when we affiliated with Kendal, he joined in. As I say, this really remarkable group of people, and that is really my point. I get arguably too much credit in many circles for what I always have said is a group effort. That's why it was successful. That group, too, was noticeable, that gave credibility, first of all, to the wider community. These were trusted members of our community. It attracted Kendal, who noticed who was on this, and this was truly a community organization. And who would notice that especially, but Fred and Isabel Hartenstein, who were looking to do something with Sunnyside. And they saw what we were doing, and shall we say the rest is history. So I'll turn over to Diane.
Wow, when you start going through some of those details, and there was so many steps, but that was indeed an all-star team. Everyone at the table knew what they would do and when they needed to step up to the plate in order to do it, and they did it. And like David said, it was a wonderful group to work with. And they hung in there for the whole time. To think about having a community out of the air is really awesome to do it. And I said that I would do some of the follow-up details and so on. And I remember early on, I had an idea of what a retirement community, continuing care retirement community would be, because my in-laws lived in one up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and Bruce and I saw how it was really a wonderful situation for them to be in as they were aging. And I just kept making calls to different people to see how to go about even doing this. I had no experience in this. And I remember one call that I made to someone that someone said I should call, and she said CCRC, and I said, what's that? And there was this pause, and I could almost hear her saying, oh, honey, have you got a long way to go? It was a long way to go. But we followed up and talking to people. There's people in the community that said, yes, this is a great idea, do this. And how do we even start? So some money got together, and we found out people that would be good to hire for a market study. It didn't make any sense for us to start unless we knew that there would be enough people there. So we combed our different list of people that might want to come to something like this. And we met in the meeting room at then RE Lee. And people said, yes, yes. And the market people that we had in said, yes, you have that kind of a margin where this might work. And we were so elated. So then the board decided, okay, Now what do we need to do? We knew our community and what we wanted, but we absolutely don't know this business. It's very complicated, and I see some of our wonderful staff here. It's complicated. And so we knew we would need an affiliation. We knew that we would need money. We knew that we would need a place where this would be. There were all sorts of things that we needed to get in place in order to begin to proceed, for us to have a place where people even thought they might want to come. And the whole time we would be talking to some of the prospective people. Some of them are here. Some of you are there. As we were going about it. And I remember when we were talking about an affiliation, David at first thought that it might be Westminster Canterbury. And they were in an expansion project, so H. Carey said, no, thank you. We talked to Sunnyside up in Harrisonburg, and they came here and said, well, we own it and we run it. And that wasn't what we had in mind. We wanted to have the say-so for a community that was going to be in our community. And Beth had been in contact with Kendal, so we kind of were reaching out like this to see, and they said, well, but you're very small, and it's hard to have enough rooftops to make the financing work on setting up a retirement community. We talked to them more, and so on. At the same time, we were also looking for where this might be, and I've said this story sometime. One realtor said to me, Dianne, I know a great location. You go through the parking lot at Walmart to go there. And I thought, At the same time, David had baptized the Bartenstein's grandchild, and John Elliston had told us about a couple that came into his office and said, we've just acquired the sole ownership of Sunnyside Farm, about 600 acres. What is it that the community would like? And John about slid off his chair because what he usually hears are complaints about things that didn't happen. So he knew that piece of things. So we thought, well, we should go and talk to the Bartensteins. And they were getting to know us and what we were doing. And I remember we were going to go ask them if we could buy some of the land on Sunnyside Farm. And we were in Isabel's cottage, and they said, we would like to give you the land for this. I thought I would levitate out of the chair, because at that point, a lot of these are tumbled together. Kendal, if we were to affiliate with them or to have them to have us be a Kendal community, said you're going to need about $2 million in equity to offset not having as big a population here. And that, I mean, this is 1994. That's a lot of money for us to be thinking about. Good as Harris was, that still was a lot of money. And here was the gift that we wouldn't have to purchase the land up front, that it was given to us. So it was really a huge asset for us. Some people said, well, yeah, but usually when you're given something, it's about what it's worth, which is nothing. But we had some people come up to verify that this was indeed a good site for us. We got verification. At the same time, we would have meetings. And again, it's these wonderful people who would come and say, yes, keep doing this. Keep on taking steps to see if we can do it. Then there was the affiliation with Kendal, and that was many different steps along the way. Would they or wouldn't they have us? Tell about our visit when we finally met with a full board up there.
Well, excuse me. Oh, that's done. Sorry. Shocked me too. Yes, 4 or 5 of us went up there. You and I, Beth, Matt Paxton, possibly Barton. And we went out and we were greeted by, we checked in and we came to the nurse's station to get where we were, the key to where we were going. She said, oh, are you friends? And I looked at each other, yeah, we're friends. Oh. But we did meet before, And we presented this, and we realized that this was something of a challenge for some people because, among other things, we have in our community the Virginia Military Institute, and Quakers are not there. And so, but we found out that the vice chair of the board happened to be in the United States Navy, and there was the Grande Dame, who was the widow. She and her husband had founded Kendal all together. And at lunch, she leaned over me, and patted my arm, and said, "My brother went to Vienna." There was one other story that they came down, the delegation of them came down to Lexington with spouses, and I don't know if Mary Rain Paxton is here, but she and Matt had them to dinner. So Mary Rain and others made sure that the spouses, or the women, were all very well escorted, and some of the men too, around Lexington. So by the time they got to dinner at Matt's and Mary Rain's house, very, very wonderful home, they were already sold. But the hospitality that they experienced that night, that really sealed the deal. And it was also significant because, if I remember correctly, that was also the night that Dianne was elected to the Lexington City Council. So, yeah.
Well, it was a wonderful story about all of these different steps that we would take, that the people would say, well, keep going, and we would do a little more, and they would. We'll hear more of the steps as we go along. We finally affiliated with Kendal. And so then we had the expertise of Kendal Corporation. At that point, we called it K-Corp. And they had people that were experienced in doing this. We had Jeff House, who was the particular project coordinator that we worked with. Kendal was also looking to set up a community on Hudson. And so we would hear stories about how that was going on. So when they came down here, they said, here are the steps that you need to do, setting up an office and getting that. Betsy actually came on, and then Elizabeth did. I had been on the board, and after we saw that this was going to keep on moving forward, or it was worthwhile pursuing to see if it would happen. I stopped another part-time job that I had, and I actually started really digging and spending the time on the phone and taking care of meetings. I met a lot with David in planning the strategy of how we would get people involved, how we would talk to the different people. It's just a lot of details that you have to follow up with. And then Elizabeth came, and we were moving on to some of the next steps.
As I say, all the way along, please notice, it's a group effort. So many people who made this possible.
So let's transition now to Elizabeth, who was the first marketing director. And I, as a member of the current marketing team, I brag about her all the time. What I get to sell is this beautiful community with these friendly, wonderful people who live here, the wonderful staff. She had to sell it when it was a farm pasture. Elizabeth, tell us how that all worked.
Well, you have to know that I had been a school teacher. I knew nothing about marketing. So Kendal Corporate had people who were training me, and I would go up to Kennett Square, and they would say, now for the next 2 months, this is what you're going to do. And I would come back, and we would have meetings around in different parts of the county, informational meetings, and we would invite church groups and Ruatan and a whole lot of folks who live in the county to let them know what a CCRC is and about the Kendal Corporation and what we were trying to do. And they would say, if they don't really understand what a CCRC is, bring busloads up to Kendal Longwood. We'll show them what a CCRC is. So we organized bus trips up there. We did a whole lot of educating, informing people. But I was also told that I needed to be meeting with individuals. And as Kevin has said, we had no architectural drawings. We had barely hired architects. We had no idea what the fees were going to be. but I know you're gonna love it. One of the things that was very interesting was that when we would ask local people, would you have a group of people that you think might be interested in something like Kendal to come for coffee and tell them why you're thinking about doing it? Yes, indeed, Mary and Sid did that. Every time we asked somebody to write an article for the newspaper or the newsletter that we were putting out, everybody always agreed to do it. It was a huge team effort. So let me tell one more quick story and I'll pass it on. When it was time for us to go to financing, this was going to be done with bonds, IDA bonds, and it was going to be a bond underwriter. And they required that 70% of the units that we were building would be under contract for 35% of the entry fee. That seemed like a really big mountain to climb. Are you willing to put down 35% on something that they haven't even started building yet? But we would get really, really, really close, and then somebody would die. And then we would get really, really, really close again, and somebody would change their minds. And finally, one day, Bill Yost, who was the finance guy at Kendal Corporate, called me one day and said, have you sold any do you have contracts on any of the cottages in Cottage Cluster 3? No. It's out of there. We are building one less cottage clusters to get us to 70% today because interest rates are really favorable and they're about to go up. So that's how we got started on construction, because we could not start building a thing until we had $18.5 million worth of bonds.
Quick story to tell the enthusiasm, but I would be at church greeting people when they come down the steps, and Helen would be followed by her husband Hal, who would invariably ask me, how are we coming? How are we coming? I also want to say the support that we had from the top of the Kendal Corporation. Alan Hunt, the president, John Diffie, or the sort of the chair of the board, John Diffie, the president, really wanted this to happen, and that made all the difference.
Why did he want it to happen here? Because he had his place
over in Bath County, yeah.
I want to tell an incident from office days that came up at the dinner table. We had a lot of mailings, and a lot of you who are here helped us in the office and so on. And I remember one time we had the stack of envelopes ready to go out, and oh my goodness, we forgot to put something in it. And they were stamped and everything like that. Well, Ann Tucker was there that day, and she said, oh, it's okay, I know how to open up envelopes. And she's got a pencil. And so she just twirled her pencil and opened them up, and then we put in what we needed to and sealed them back up again.
Ingenuity. All right, I'd like to now talk about the early days of 2000, the year that the first residents moved in to Kendal, Lexington. It was July of 2000, and Mary Coulling was one of the very first, along with her husband. Mary, tell us some of your memories of moving into Kendal, Lexington.
Well, my husband and I, early on, knew that we would want to go to a retirement community. My husband had health issues for many years. We had relatives who had gone to various CRCs, and we knew we wanted to come to some place like this. So we were thrilled when the idea was first floated, and we supported it as wholeheartedly as we could. We were not the very first person to come. The very first person who came was Adelaide Simpson. She had been perhaps the resident ahead of us who was more enthusiastic than we were. And so she was number one coming in. She arrived with her moving van at 8:30 in the morning on July the 17th. The moving people went back to our house. She lived next door to us. They moved back to pick up our things at 9:30 and we were in well. Amazing. What was here was certainly different from what you see today. The lobby, as you see it, was there. What is now the marketing was the library, with nothing in it at the moment. The Kendal Hall was non-existent. Now, if you walk downstairs,
Hold the mic closer.
the dining room was ended right where the restaurant starts now. And right there was this huge tarpaulin that hung down, that flapped in the wind. And that was the end of Kendal. The south building was nothing but burgers. Cottages, the first set of cottages, we were in cluster 1. Cluster 1 and 2 had been built, 3, 4, and 5 had been built. And 6, I guess, but nothing else. There was nothing over on Sycamore, there was nothing up on the ridge. The first night, we walked down the steps where you walk down now, and there was one table down there with a dozen chairs for the 9 of us who moved in, and we had dinner with champagne and Cherry's Jubilee. But outside, there was no grass, no trees. You won't believe that almost every tree on this complex has been built since we moved in. The only trees that were there were those around Sunnyside House.
May I add a note here? There was no carpet in this entrance hall in the foyer here. There was no wallpaper. It really was a building site. And the executive director, Steve Jewell, brought his inline skates in and skated around.
Wires all across the floor. So you had to step over wires to come down. When we first had our first exercise group, it was out in the lobby. And we all got up there and did with our dumbbells. And people would walk in wondering what was going on. The first concerts or meetings were held in the lobby. Vespers was held in the lobby. The change when Kendal Hall was built was just extraordinary. When we moved in, we obviously were displacing the mice that used to be here. So a lot of us had mice visiting us for the first few months until people managed to trap them and drop them over the side. We had, before we actually moved in, we had these long waits. My husband and I, from where we lived, could see Sunnyside and hear Sunnyside being built, see Kendal being built. And month after month after month, we would hope that we could move in soon. Some of us had sold our houses early, and at least one family, Ellen Head and her husband Al, sold their house the day after. They first thought they might move soon, and it sold the next day. They moved to another location, much smaller, and when they were told they might get in, they put their house on the market, and it sold the next day. So a lot of people in that first year had to move to temporary places that had been built but not sold yet. So several people had to move 2 or 3 times. My husband and I were lucky. We moved into cottage 1003, and I'm still here.
Thank you, Mary. Ruth Woodcock, you are up next. Tell us about your memories of the first.
First of all, I wouldn't have come here if Kenneth Square, Kendal, had room. They said you'd have to wait 7 years before you could get a 2-bedroom apartment. So I quickly decided I don't want to wait, and I heard about the building of this one. And so we came to see the people here, and it was nothing but mud. They were beginning to dig, and I only made one trip here, and the rest I had to figure out from home, which was Cape Cod. And so I came not in July, but in August, and we stayed in 2 studio apartments while the South building was being finished. And then we moved in there in November. But I want to tell you a little bit about how the residents got organized. There was an organizing committee that put forth a draft of bylaws. One of the residents here was Alta Fowler, who had been a classmate of mine in graduate school. And we looked at that draft and we said, oh, it needs work. So we worked hard on it. And it was approved by this interim committee. And that's how the Residents Association began. And because I didn't know anybody here, but because I had worked on the bylaws, they asked me to be on the council the first year. And after the first year, I became the president for 2 years. And we did a lot of things. We didn't have a handbook, so we had a group. I think Sarah was part of it. We worked on a handbook, which I think you all get now. It's being updated regularly. We didn't have an activity director, and we were told that all the activities would have to be organized by the residents. So that was the beginning of all these committees. So you've heard about them, and you know they're still going strong. And we even have more committees now than we had then, and we have a lot of interest groups. But we also had a lot of residents who were willing to pitch in and do things. And so it isn't so much what we didn't have. We didn't have board, we couldn't use Sunnyside. We had no fitness center, as Mary said, we were in the lobby. But we had residents who were really enterprising, and we made the best of everything, and we had a good time doing it. And I think that it has carried on, and it wasn't long before things were started. If one of the residents thought it would be nice to have conversation in our living room, which was the lobby out here. And so we started conversation, and it's going on strong today. And we had another resident who thought we should do something about lifelong learning. And so Kendal College was started, and that's going strong. And so many of the things, and I think the important thing is the residents who came early were not concentrating on what we didn't have. We concentrated on what we did have. We had a beautiful field over that way, full of birds and flowers and places we could walk. We had a lot of other things that were going on, and we joined together. We had a lovely dining room. We went for a meal a day. We went every day for a meal, and we got acquainted with people that way, and we enjoyed that. And we had a wonderful chef at the time. And so I think residents were really resilient and adaptable, and I think they are today.
One characteristic I think of all of the early newcomers here was a sense of gratitude. We were so grateful that we had a place here that we could come to. We were so grateful to the people who had worked so hard on the committees, grateful to Kendal Court for taking us on and helping us get started. So I think it was, in addition to being willing to try new things and willing to take on a lot of work, there was a real sense of gratitude about the whole enterprise. that we all felt, and we wanted to pay back that part of it.
Thank you, Mary. All right, Sarah Giddings, you also moved here in the year 2000, and but I think I remember you telling me that your cottage wasn't ready yet.
Do you remember Mary commented that she lived in cluster 1? We lived in cluster 8. We had sold our house in Raleigh, and the kids who bought it said, oh, sure, you can stay a little while if your house isn't quite ready for you. That was in July, and about the 1st of October, they said, you know, we did buy your house. We sort of like to have it. So we came up here, and my husband and my 2 dogs and I lived in Webster for 10 weeks while they broke ground for cluster 8 and built cluster 8, and all the way, the whole thing, we moved into our cottage the day after Christmas, which was an interesting move. But one of the things that David, of course, has been commenting on was how it was a local and everybody was so wonderful and friendly. We came not knowing a soul, and that lasted maybe 24 hours. I doubt if it was that long. We were greeted with open arms, with love, with compassion. Oh, we are so glad you are here. And I think Ruth felt the same thing. You came from afar. It just the friendliness that we ran into here. We were quite familiar with Kendal. That's how we found it. My parents had lived at Kendal at Longwood. When I discovered that, hey, Don, they're building a Kendal in the mountains of Virginia. And his comment was, so let's go. So we tossed the dogs in the car and drove up here from Raleigh and put down our $1,000 for the original deposit. Got as far toward home as approximately Goodwill. Looked at each other and said, you know, that unit that we wanted, there was only one of those. Made a U-turn, came back, gave them the deposit on that unit, and several months, shall we say, later, moved in. And I've not regretted it for a minute, honestly.
I would like to comment that we had meetings locally here because we needed people in this area to know about Kendal. But people from other places knew about Kendal. All of, you know, there's 9 other Kendals on the East Coast, and they wanted a Kendal with a milder winter, in a smaller community, less traffic, lower entry fees, all kinds of reasons. But from the very beginning, we've been about 50% locals and 50% people who come from other places. From the very beginning and to this day, I think that's still correct.
One of the things that the Kendal organizing group did was have these meetings ahead of time. And at one of the meetings, they passed around very large pieces of paper and said, if there's something you're interested in, why don't you start a piece of paper and see if other people are interested in that? And that's how a number of our interest groups got started. The reporter group that I was in for up until this year started that way. One of the early residents had said, I play reporter, and I thought, yeah, so do I. So there we had the reporter group. And the bridge group, I think, was the biggest of the interest groups to start with, but there's all kinds of others. I look at Ted and I see the photography group has been very active.
Elizabeth had to deal with telling people, well, your place isn't going to be ready. And all of the punching that went on from there. I commend you.
Board meeting, when the head of construction for the Kendal Corporation told the board that the south building and several of the cottage clusters were not going to be ready on time. big tears rolled down my cheeks. And Ferris Hotchkiss sent me the nicest email afterwards. This is the fundraiser at WNL, who, by the way, with his committee, raised $1 million in startup money for us. Then the people at Kendal Corporation wrote a script for me so that when I call people like the Giddings, I could say, we have several options for you to consider. So that really was a challenge.
Well, today, Kendal Lexington has 210 independent living residents and another 60 between assisted living and skilled nursing. But with 270 total residents, we are still the smallest of all the Kendal affiliates. So when somebody new moves in, it's kind of a big deal. But I have to imagine in the year 2000, when somebody new moved in, the whole community gathered around. Anybody else have any memories from that first year that they'd like to share?
There's a million, but.
I think when we had those early meetings that brought people in, we had an ice cream social over on the lawn in front of Sunnyside, or we have another gathering and bring people who are prospectives coming down. One of the interesting things that started right then and is still going on is how people who came from different places had had contacts with each other beforehand. Lewis Harlan, who came from teaching, and his wife, who came from teaching at the University of Maryland, met Joe Martin, who was teaching at VMI, and they looked at each other and they realized they'd been roommates at Vanderbilt and graduate school. And this has happened over and over again. There's somebody here who was in kindergarten with somebody else. The Bridges were in kindergarten with somebody else. Anyway, that just shows how if people from various places had the same kind of interests and enthusiasms and desires to come together.
I'd like to say something about the staff. We heard about the marketing staff, but we had other staff, and they were just learning their way too. And so I think we should give credit to them for helping us to have such a good time as residents and make the transition to this kind of a life. And they worked hard and they learned as they went. And we had a nurse practitioner who taught us all how to use our pets and when to pull the cars. And we had really dedicated staff, and we appreciate that.
Helen, who is on the staff as a cleaner, is the other person who is still living, who moved here with me on moving day. So when you see Helen, you can call her a pioneer.
I hear a lot of pride from every single person on this panel about what happened here. Oh, is there a question?
I do have a question. I heard fairly recently that there are documents about the beginnings of the library. And in fact, that started before Kendal ever opened. And I wondered, Sarah, if you could talk about that.
We used to, the library committee, which was formed at that meeting where we signed our interest sheets, used to meet in the Tutwiler's living room before anybody moved in. And we set up a few policies and agreement, decided that everybody could bring 250 books. Remember, the library was where those two marketing offices are now. And then one whole wall was taken up by a fireplace. The fireplace was very pretty, but people would forget to turn it off sometimes, and it got very hot in there.
And I can remember that Bill Watt, who was a chemistry professor, said, "Can I bring 250 chemistry textbooks?" And the library committee said no.
We did put down a little bit of a rules and regulations, but that 250 limit was relatively strictly enforced, but it was quite a variety. And at that time, we decided not to go with Dewey Decimal or any of to be really formal, but to just make the genres that we use today. And I think that, I don't know that we've changed any of them.
I have a question. One of the things that people tell me about when they first come to Kendal is that they are startled and joyous about walking into the library and not into a reception area. When did we begin to expand? How did that happen?
That happened with phase 2. When we built Kendal Hall, they took away our library and said, no, we're going to put the books where people can see them. And it was one of the most brilliant decisions they've made anywhere along the way, I think. But people walk in who have never seen us before. Kevin, you'll agree with this. Look at the books. There's books everywhere. So that has been a great part of, that was phase 2.
Madison.
I'm here to tell you that I have read at least one history of a Kendal organization, and I would not wish that on any of you. Trailblazers, thank you so much for giving us so much to remember, like you remember. And if this is not produced word for word, we all have missed a magnificent book.
David, please wrap it up for us.
Thank you. Whoa, should up the volume. One more comment, if I may. And that is about the board. You know, I talked about the initial exploratory committee that led to the board and so on. And it occurred to me that each board president has had a particular accomplishment. Mine was to get to groundbreaking. And then I went off as president of the board, or chair of the board, and stayed on as a member of the board. Beth Thompson took over, and she was the one that hired under her, our first executive director came in. She left that position, Matt Paxton took over, and it was under Matt that the Borden Center became part of Kendal. And I kind of lose it from there because I was less affiliated at that point. But it does go on, and I see a number of the members of the board here today, including our current chair, Pam Lucky, who herself is going to have lead Kendal into its next phase. And I just want to recognize that that tradition of service continues so admirably. And I hope that all of us are grateful for their service.
Thank you to our panel for taking the time to share your memories of the early days and the creation of Kendal Lexington. And thanks all of you for coming to enjoy and listen. And now it's time for a little wine reception out in the libraries.